My name's Keith Rowland. I also want to give you a warm welcome today for our gathering. People from the 3 states plus national leaders. The presentations, including the 3 concurrent sessions, will be posted in about a week's time. So we'll send you a link and you'll be able to see those and share those. A couple of thanks are in order. First, to Teresa Singleton for continued support of exploration of apprenticeship as a workforce strategy. To Nathaniel and Jenny for countless logistics involved in putting together a meeting like this. And I do mean nearly countless. Edison Frary from JEVS, who has given creative ideas, connections to people in the course of the event, and John Colborn, also at JEVS, for different parts of the agenda today. And Luke Ryan. Luke, are you in the audience? There he is. So, Director of Career and Technical Education in Delaware. So he conceived the regional outlook, economic outlook that you just saw. And from when he first expressed it, it made sense as I talked to people. So thank you. If you're posting on social media, the hashtag is PHL Apprenticeship Work. And now it's my pleasure to introduce the next 2 speakers. Bob Lerman is an Institute Fellow at the Urban Institute, Emeritus Professor of Economics at American University, and he's a Research Fellow at IZA, which is a Labor Economics Institute in Germany. He's written or co-authored 89 research publications, many on apprenticeship, but others on inequality, income support, youth employment. Currently, he's principal investigator of federally funded evaluations of apprenticeship demonstration grants. He's also directly involved in a contract to build occupational competency frameworks for apprenticeship. And he's engaged in federally funded and other initiatives to expand apprenticeships in the U.S. Next will be Zakiya Smith Ellis, New Jersey Secretary of Higher Education. She previously led work at the Lumina Foundation to advance federal policy to increase attainment and develop new post-secondary finance models. In prior positions, she was a senior advisor for education at the White House Domestic Policy Council, and was a senior advisor in the U.S. Department of Education, where she developed solutions to challenges in college access, affordability, and completion. Earlier in her career, she worked directly with students in the K-12 system. So, Bob and Zakiya, would you please come forward?
See, maybe you could just shut that off somehow. Well, thank you very much. The talk this morning reminded me of a talk I gave in 1998 on the future of work. And in that talk, I emphasized how jobs were becoming more challenging, requiring more skill, even more creative, and that was a big positive. Because imagine the opposite. Suppose jobs were dumbing down and so on. But it posed a big challenge, namely, how do we help people gain those skills, get that creativity, participate? Well, I've moved from analyzing the numbers, which our colleague did a great job of, to a more fun task of, well, what do we do about it? And I've been arguing for a few decades that a big part of the solution is to emphasize apprenticeship. And right now we have a key moment in the nation because we have what I would call a second chance to embrace apprenticeship. I am try to keep myself modest because in 1992, President George H.W. Bush proposed the National Youth Apprenticeship Act of 1992. And Bill Clinton liked apprenticeship. But somehow it fell flat. We weren't able to do it. So as I was telling my colleague last night, I don't want us to be 0 for 2 and lose the momentum this time. But I do think we're in a different place. We've learned more. We've seen more examples of what can be done. And at the same time, I think people are losing faith in what I call the pure academic-only approach to learning. And I do want to emphasize, if there's only one thing that one takes away from my talk, it's that apprenticeship is fundamentally about learning. It's fundamentally about learning, and learning in a highly productive way. So we're seeing the skill mismatches. We're seeing some decline in the interest of what I call academic only, which is stay in school as long as you can, and then maybe look for a job after that. We're seeing the recognition that learning can take place not just in classrooms, but outside the school environment. We're learning about the fact that other countries have done very well with their young people. The example I would cite most is that 95% of Swiss 25-year-olds have either a BA or an apprenticeship. They have a lower BA rate than we do and a higher per capita income than we do. And we're talking about 95%, so we're talking about inclusive. And we're now seeing bipartisan support. We're seeing governors take the lead. We're seeing the Congress provide much larger appropriations for apprenticeships from the very tiny numbers that we had up until very recently. So this increased support is very important, but still, for us to achieve the levels, the proportions of apprentices that we see in the high apprenticeship countries, or even some medium ones like England, we'd have to have a 9 or 10-fold increase. So we have a big challenge ahead. Don't lose heart. Though we're up to it, I think, this time. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about a few questions, the why and the how. Most of you here understand why we should do apprenticeship. Let's just first make sure we have all the same definition of what we mean, because sometimes other people confuse them with internships. It's a job. It's a job with structured work-based learning under a qualified mentor trainer. It does include some theoretical instruction, but very critically, it's not just a learn and earn approach, which some people mention, that you're learning and earning a salary. It's also a learn, earn, and produce approach, because you're contributing to production. And in economics, we call that a dual production. So we're producing both skills and output. Ideally, these structures are guided by well-defined occupational frameworks. Keith, thanks for mentioning our project on occupational frameworks. We have Diana Elliott, who's the head of that project. We have now something like 30 or more occupational areas. If you want to look at those, look at just apprenticeship features, Urban Institute features apprenticeship. If you Google that, you'll find those frameworks. And so let's remind ourselves why workers benefit. Because there's some controversy, maybe not in this room. There is some controversy that, well, everybody needs to be entirely generally trained, and that training toward a particular occupational area will, in the long term, be not so efficient. And I don't agree with those critiques. Because I think, as I mentioned, it's a highly effective mode of learning. And moreover, I think it's a more equitable approach to learning. Because many people, I would say most people, learn best by doing. When their academic learning is reinforced by action, they manage to retain it much higher. It is true that there's no lost or foregone earnings during the learning process. And this is critical also, because many critics, as I mentioned, say, well, that's good for starting a job, but what about later in your career? And the reality is that if you look at what share of people who've gone through apprenticeships in their, let's say, 50s, and you ask them, well, what share of what you learned then do you still use? And a high share of them say, a great deal of what I learned then, I use today. Another thing that's often overlooked is the idea of learning to learn. When people complete apprenticeships, they not only have learned to learn, but they also have something that we often, in the statistics, don't really look at, which is the idea of pride. Having pride in what you're doing, feeling that you've accomplished something, you know a field better than your neighbor. Whatever the neighbor can do, they can't do what you can do. And that sense of pride, and even being not just part of a pride, but also part of being a community of learners in that field. That's a very powerful thing. I know that many people in the world of the people with occupations here are part of a community of practice. So we're widening the range of those that can do that. But with an apprenticeship, to have an apprenticeship, you need an employer to offer a position. That, by the way, is one of the great guarantees that we won't have a big mismatch. You know, if you're starting a training program, all you have to do is rent some space, recruit some people, hire a few teachers, and say, oh, well, I looked at this statistic, and they're going to need these people. But you don't know. You don't know when they leave what kind of jobs they're going to get. With an apprenticeship, you don't have a position unless you have an employer that feels they're going to need some skilled person in that field in the future. So it avoids mismatches. Another thing that's often made difficult when you're trying to recruit employers for apprenticeship is the cost. But if you look at the literature in a large number of apprenticeships, employers are able to recoup the cost of the apprenticeship during the apprenticeship itself. Why? Because they would have to hire somebody to do the work of the apprentice, and very quickly the apprentice gains some significant skills and begins to spend part of his time or her time on skilled jobs, but are still being paid in the context of apprenticeship. What we've seen from research on a couple of major case studies in the United States is that apprenticeships can raise what we economists call capacity utilization of companies. Because you have apprentices learning a range of skills. If somebody doesn't show up, or somebody is missing for a few weeks, or something happens, very often the apprentice can fill in. Not in the first day, but within the first year or two. In the case of Siemens, for example, which spends a massive amount of money, I don't encourage you to look at the number of what they spend. But even they found a significant return on their investment, mainly because they were able to improve the utilization of capacity, and that was worth a whole lot. In the case of the Dartmouth Hitchcock Health Center, another employer using apprentices, they found that a lot of the costs were offset by reduction in overtime, as well as increased revenue from bookings that medical assistants were able to do, well-trained ones. So it does work for employers. I think it works especially well for us as taxpayers. The current system is very expensive. And remember, although we have 500,000 plus apprentices in the country, we have something like 7 million in community colleges and another 12 million in four-year colleges. So it's still not the dominant mode of skill development. But one of the big differences between the federal government or state government promoting apprenticeship is this. When you have a training program, then every year, a regular training program that we've had all over the years, every year you have to find the money, or if, let's say, even a community college position, every year you have to find the money to do that. So the cost is the same almost every year. It's going up a bit, but anyway, it's the same or going up. In the case of apprenticeship, because so much of the learning is job-related and employers are basically bearing a lot of the costs, the big cost is getting employers to get started. Once you get them started, the repeat business will go along and you get a whole flow of training dollars that the government does not have to spend on. So, yes, the government will still maybe help with the off-job learning in courses, but that's maybe a quarter of the learning process and the cost of learning progress. In Washington State, they found returns of something like 30 to 1 for the government. So what's going on to take advantage of all this? What are we seeing? Well, as I mentioned, there is increased funding. For those of you that know about the H-1B program, which is a temporary visa program, employers have had to put in funding, and the Labor Department has had wide discretion to use that. And late in the Obama administration and throughout the Trump administration, that money has been used to support apprenticeship. In addition, the congressional authorizations are going from something like the old days of 30 million a year to 150 to 200 million a year. There's an effort in the Congress right now to revise the 1937 law on apprenticeship. We've been developing these competency frameworks, and there's been a lot of effort in the Office of Apprenticeship, I'm happy to see, to update data and information. I would recommend on April 6th, they're going to have a big, I think anyway, a big effort to expand the knowledge about apprenticeship at a website called apprenticeship.gov. So that's one big thing that's happening. A second thing, I don't want to spend much time, I'm probably out of time, is about this controversy over industry recognized apprenticeships and registered apprenticeships. I'll just give you a quick statement, which is that it was well-intentioned. The idea of dealing with some of the complexities of the registered system in a way that would promote much more industry involvement is a good idea. I think, unfortunately, it got into a partisan debate, and so the verdict is still out on that. But in the meantime, registered apprenticeships, that system is improving. We have Jim Fody here, head of the Philadelphia region, and I know he's always done a great job, and he's continuing to do a great job. But there have been other improvements. So I just want to cover two more topics quickly. One is how do you get into an apprenticeship? How does an employer start an apprenticeship? Well, what we're seeing now used to be a lot harder. And the reason was that we did have one group in the building trades where there was very systematic activity. If you were a construction company, even just starting, you could sign on with a joint labor management program or with even a non-union joint group program. And they would handle a lot of stuff for you. But if you were not outside of that field, you would have to develop your skill frameworks, find a way of registering, find a way of identifying applicants and so on. What we're seeing now is the increase in what we would call group sponsorship, but not purely in construction, but a way in which organizations, I just met the Hanover Chamber head here, who is Hanover, Pennsylvania, who told me that he is a group sponsor, but other group sponsors. What do I mean by a group sponsor? A group sponsor is an entity, could be one employer, could be a high school, could be a chamber, could be an industry association. It takes it upon itself to find a set of occupations that are in need, to register their activity with the Department of Labor, either a state or the federal department, and then make it very easy for companies to sign up. In fact, they only have to sign up like 1/3 of a page is all the paperwork that a company needs when they sign up with a group sponsor. So we're seeing, for example, the Independent Insurance Agents of Kentucky, Maryville High School in Tennessee, an IT company in Kentucky called Interapt. They're all group training sponsors, and they're going to be able to help you find all the technical support you need to start an apprenticeship. We at Urban Institute have 2 contracts with the Department of Labor, one on tech apprenticeships and one on youth apprenticeships, and we have free technical assistance to companies that want to start apprenticeship and even to groups that want to become group sponsors. I can't close without talking a little bit about banks. We're actually all here in the Federal Reserve Bank of Philadelphia, and thanks to Keith Rowland so much for your hard work on apprenticeship over the years. Just want to say there are several areas where there are really too few apprentices, where apprenticeship can be extremely helpful as a learning process as a way of diversifying your workforce, as a way of having people who are loyal to you gain the pride in their occupation. I think one area, interestingly enough, people talk about jobs in construction, but actually residential construction has not really been penetrated much with apprenticeship. There are a lot of reasons for that. But turning to banking, we have very few in banking in the United States. And yet, in other countries, that's a fairly significant number. And I just did one wonderful site that you could go to is the Institute for Apprenticeship in the UK. And they have lists of all the skill requirements in a variety of occupations. And I just looked up some of the occupations that they have: managing branches, customer financial advice, actuarial technician, compliance risk officer, internal audit practitioner, workplace pensions administrator, investment operations specialist. All these fields, which are very common in finance and banking, in the UK, they're using these fields to expand apprenticeship and as a way of learning. So I hope that inspires some of you in the banking field. I may have gone over my time. I'm already well into the Q&A period. And thank you very much for listening, and onward. Let's not go 0 for 2.
Okay, I am not Bob Lerman, but you just heard from him. I'm Zakiya Smith-Ellis. I'm the Secretary of Higher Education in the state of New Jersey. You may be wondering, what is a higher education person doing here at an apprenticeship summit? But presumably I've been invited because we have a strong interest in merging work-based learning and apprenticeships, more specifically with traditional higher education. And I would say, I think a lot of times people think of these two things as separate. They think of them as kind of two ends of the coin. Either you can go and be an apprentice or you can go to college. And I would argue that that is actually a disservice to the origins of the higher education enterprise in the United States. Most colleges, our oldest, I wouldn't say most, but our oldest colleges actually started as practical training institutes. Harvard was a seminary, and many other old colleges in the United States were normal schools for teachers. I got my undergraduate education in secondary education and political science, and I trained to be a teacher, where it was very much, other than the critical component of being paid, very much like an apprenticeship, where I was in a classroom working with students, and then I would go back to a classroom where I would learn about pedagogy and then take it back, and it was a symbiotic relationship. And what we know from how all people learn is that that is actually the best way to learn anything. The method where somebody is just standing in front of you and you do not have the opportunity to apply it in a real context is the worst way to learn. And that is what we know from all pedagogy about children, about adults, about anyone learning anything, that you learn by doing. We all learn by doing, and that is true in every context. When you think about doctors, I think you would not want a doctor to diagnose you for something that had not had the opportunity to practice that under the supervision of somebody who was a master doctor, right, or a well-experienced person, and then learn from their mistakes in a supervised setting, in a classroom. If you had a doctor who said, "I've learned a lot about this by taking tests and studying exams," you would say, "No, thank you." If you had a lawyer who had only read about the law in books, and maybe even passed all of their law school exams, but never actually practiced. That's why we call it practicing law, right? They never practiced under the supervision of an attorney, who then they could get some advice about how to. You would say, no, thank you. So I would say many of what we think of traditional higher education occupations, the best training actually comes in what we would consider something very similar to an apprenticeship. And I think I am here today and am such a fan of this model Because anything that is not that, anything that is learning in isolation from the applicability of it is bad learning. It's actually bad practice. And so I would hope that over time, apprenticeship becomes the exception and not, I mean, the rule and not the exception. Right now, we think of higher education as, you know, you do this stuff, you go to school, you learn in a disconnected way. It's just, many students find that to be uninteresting, and I would say that they are not wrong for finding it uninteresting. If you actually find it interesting to learn in a way that is disconnected from any application or ability to practice what you're learning, that should be odd. And so I feel strongly that we've really allowed generations and generations of students to feel that they are somehow not performing, or they are somehow inadequate because they don't learn best in an isolated scenario where there's no opportunity to actually apply what you're learning in a real world context. And we've done a disservice to people for thinking that they are, you know, kind of not academic, not smart, if you will. And in actuality, I would say if you thrive in a context where you're not ever applying, and if you have no ability to apply what you're learning, I would kind of counter and say that's where we need some remediation. if that's the context. And any of you that have hired anyone who looks good on paper and then can't do the job knows that what you really want is somebody who has had that opportunity to really apply their context. So I'm just here to say that we are doing this in New Jersey, and my colleague from the New Jersey, the Commissioner of Labor, Robert Sarlo-Angelo, is here, and he's going to be on the next panel to talk about, hopefully, some of the work that I did. We didn't confer ahead of time, but we've been in enough things together to talk about some of the work that we're doing together. But I will note that one of these things is called we're calling it degree apprenticeships, but it's a 2.0 version of our apprenticeship program where we're partnering with colleges and really asking them to do several things. One of them is to obviously offer apprenticeships, but also to offer credit for not only the classroom time, but the learning that apprentices have on the job. So credit for that. And then to be able to get financial aid as well as get paid for the apprenticeship, which allows them to tap into, us as a state, to tap into a broader stream of resources. So we're very excited about this. I see Nick, who's the head of this effort in New Jersey, is here as well. For folks that may have more technical questions, you can see him. Maybe he can wave a hand. And we're just thrilled. I've been talking about it with our higher education colleagues and getting a lot of positive receptivity, not just, I think, a lot of times we think about it community colleges, but we have some of our four-year institutions that are really excited about this model, have been doing apprenticeships. And I know our commissioner is very interested in that, what Bob just mentioned, moving apprenticeships out of just only thinking of it as a technical skills and technical fields into even government, into areas that are typically thought of just kind of preparation for the humanities. And I just can't say enough how important that is, because if you're an English major, if you're a philosophy major, I believe, actually, as somebody that was a humanities major, that I know that there is applicability in the real world for those things. The problem becomes when you have students believe that there isn't, and probably even worse when you have faculty members believe that there isn't applicability of what you're learning. And I tell faculty all the time, don't downplay yourselves to think, I would hate to be in a room of educators who say, I don't think there's any relevance to what I'm teaching for people who want to become classroom teachers. Anyone that is teaching something, you're doing it because you believe it has relevance in the world. And presumably, actually not presumably, we know that the vast majority of students who are going to college go because they want to get a good job. That is the number one reason. It actually wasn't always the number one reason, but now across all age ranges, whether you're an older adult going back to school or whether you're someone younger, the number one reason is because people want to get a good job. And it does not mean that, all of the other reasons why you might want to go to college, to learn more about yourself, to, learn for learning's sake, are inadequate. But I would say that it's really difficult to learn about yourself and to become a good citizen without a good job. And if you have an answer to that, I always ask people to see me afterwards questions because I'd be interested in that pathway as well. I know we're well over time, so I don't know if you want to do a little bit of questions or do you want to move on to the next one? 5 minutes for Q&A, so that would be fantastic. I'm going to sit next to Bob and see if you have any questions for either of them.
Hello, I'm Joe Prancer. I'm from the New Jersey Consortium of Community Colleges. We are in the process of very successfully having a groundbreaking apprenticeship in CNC manual milling lathe, right in the machinist field. We have currently over 40 apprentices signed up, funded by the state of New Jersey. It involves a year program that at the end of the year program, the student gets from Camden County College, receives from Camden County College, a 13-credit certificate in precision machine technology. All 13 credits can be applied to an associate's degree in advanced computerized manufacturing. It's selling very well. We have gotten nothing but positive feedback from the apprenticeships and the employers. It's a groundbreaker. It's doing really well, and it's the combination of higher education, apprenticeship, the combination of learning by doing, because in no other field, I mean, in advanced manufacturing, that method of learning is critical, and it's working very well. Also, may I add, the apprenticeship receives 11 NIMS, National Institute of Metalworking Skills, credentials at the end of that 13-year certificate. They get to walk in the graduation line in May at Camden County College because it is an academic achievement that can go on the resume. Thank you.
Yeah.
Yes.
First, let me say it's great to have the secretary and the commissioner here today, this morning. And I think it follows my colleague from Camden Community College. So the dropout rate is really high, both in the community colleges and four-year colleges. Do you see the apprentice concept as increasing the graduation rates? And I'm wondering if you'd like to comment on that.
Yeah, I would say, okay, I would say yes, but I mean, from my perspective, I once did a paper on community colleges and apprenticeships, and it was a union that had a program with a community college where they paid for the college, and I asked them, well, so how many of your people do the community college degree along with the apprenticeship? And he said, not very many. And I said, why? And he said, well, our apprenticeship's worth way more than the AA degree. So I do believe that colleges, community colleges, have a fantastic opportunity to become, and some are becoming, group sponsors of apprenticeships. You have people in the college whose job it is to interact with companies. So but the people have to be well-trained. It's not easy to get companies to shift from their regular HR policies to do something like apprenticeship. And those people that have heard of apprenticeship think of it in the building trades. Mm-hmm. So, maybe everybody in this room knows everything about it, but your typical employer does not. And so, or they may think it's too expensive, or they may have, 5 reasons, 5 barriers that have to be overcome to get it started. As I said, in the old days, without the group system, you might have to fill out a 60-page document to get something registered with the Department of Labor. We do have a lot of, quote, unregistered apprenticeships. We don't know how many there are, but there are many. But in terms of getting some government recognition and in some cases public support, registration is a good thing. So in the old days, it was very, very complicated. But today, you can cut through a lot of that. So I strongly encourage community colleges to be sponsors. And one more thing, which would be to train the business services people in how best, what I call, sell and organize. We cannot underestimate the importance of what I call selling and organizing apprenticeships with companies. And a regular business service person, even if though they've interacted with companies, it's not enough. It's not enough.
I think we're at time. I want to just thank you all for having us. I would say that if you are in a state, one of the things that we can do, because there is some work that needs to be done on the business and industry side, because I would say just as much, I get businesses who say, I just need engineers, and they're not actually partnering with the colleges to like kind of inform the learning. And they just are looking at people with 4-year degrees when they could be looking at a broader swath of students. So there's some work that needs to be done on the industry side. And then colleges, yes, just typically haven't been, this is not their general construction, but to be connective glue. I think that's what Nick's office is doing to try to work with businesses and to try to work with higher education to both bend a little bit.
Well, I want to thank you both, Bob and Zakiya.